And once again, thank you for being a lab member and welcome to the Los Angeles Birders webinar for our December 10th, the last webinar of 2024. If you're a member, thank you very much. In fact, everyone here just about is a member, except we also are streaming to YouTube. For you non-members, please consider joining Lab. We would appreciate your support. Your support would go to helping with these webinars, paying for our Zoom content, our Zoom ability. It helps pay for field trips, student learning opportunities, science opportunities. It anyways, it does a lot of wonderful things, and it's not expensive at all. And so thank you if you are a member. And with that, I would like to introduce Surya, one of our student birders, LA birders students, to introduce our speaker for tonight. Surya?
Thank you, Ron. Los Angeles Birders is very pleased to have Ted Keyel with us tonight. Ted is an avian ecologist and GIS analyst. Ted grew up along the Racine Lake shore in Wisconsin. He loves watching large flocks of birds and often can be found at migration sites. Ted says he's always loved raptors and bird migration, and especially large numbers of birds in migration. This works out well for raptors, since there are so many great places for viewing huge numbers of raptors in flight. Ted has been fortunate enough to be able to count at many of these locations, most notably the Florida Keys Hawk Watch, with thousands of peregrine falcons, and Veracruz, Mexico. Veracruz hosts the largest migration of birds in the world, with millions of raptors counted each season. Ted says his biggest days have exceeded 200,000 birds of prey. Ted also really enjoys photographing birds, especially birds in flight. So participating in raptor watches along with birds in flight photography provides Ted with a challenging opportunity to combine these two passions. It's our pleasure to welcome you to Lab Zone TED Talk. So without further ado, please welcome Ted.
Thank you very much, Surya, for that introduction. And I'll just share my screen. Hopefully, can someone confirm that?
Yes,
Okay.
that is up and running.
So yeah, thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm going to be talking about one of my very favorite places in the world, both in terms of migration and culture and the like, and that is the Veracruz River of Raptors, VRR. And I'll talk about the river and the raptors, but I'm also going to be talking about non-raptor species and locations around it. Unlike my previous talks, this is not going to be an identification talk. If you're interested in more identification-oriented talks, please see my earlier talks. But this talk is going to be more on just the phenomenon itself. A quick little bit of background. I first came to Veracruz during the spring of 2010. I had met someone who ran the spring count out of Chavarrillo, and he invited me to come and count. And sometimes there's times in life where you have these options for things. You're like, I don't really know how this is going to play out, but you take the leap, and one way or another, it tends to be a really good learning experience. And thankfully for me, it ended up just being a wonderful experience. Unlike the fall count, the spring count is an order of magnitude lower, so we only have, 2 to 300,000 birds moving through instead of multiple millions. And when you're first starting out, it's kind of crazy because you have a line of 200 birds. Oh my goodness, how do I count all of these? And then you have a line of 1,000 birds, and it's the same sort of thing. Oh no, how do I count all of these? But when you come back to a line of 200 birds, it's no longer quite so bad. And that tends to just kind of keep incrementing up. So fast forwarding a little bit, once I finished grad school, I went back to doing the migrant science worker thing, and I figured, well, if I'm going to do that, I might as well do it internationally. And so I reached out to my friend for the contact information for Kashmir Wolf, who's the coordinator of the Veracruz River of Raptors, asking if I could come down that fall. And he said, sure. And so I went for my first fall in 2016, and again, had an absolutely wonderful time. some more years passed. I was into environmental consulting. Things didn't go so well. I left that position in May of 2023. In around July or so, I get a message from Cash asking, "Hey, do you know anybody who can come and help us out this fall?" I said, "I'm unemployed. I don't have anything else going on at the moment, so sure, I'll come back down." And so that was how I wound up there for a second time. And again, had an absolutely wonderful time. That did not progress. And so, what is Veracruz River of Raptors? And the quick and simple answer is it's a hawk watcher's dream. It's just this avian spectacle of extraordinary proportions and numbers, and it's just really hard to believe, even when you're there witnessing it. It's utterly spectacular. And as you can see from some of the recent data in hawk count, there are literally millions of birds of prey that pass through annually. So, what does a migration spectacle like that begin to look like? And you can try photos, but I find that photos, which most of this talk will be photos, but photos I find are challenging in really capturing kind of that full awe-inspiring aspect of the migration because you have one of, I'll say, three options. Your first option is you're going for frame filling shots of individual birds, and those pictures look really nice, but they don't really show you the magnitude that is migration spectacle. Another option is to just take pictures of the kettles and lines, but those pictures are often just specks, and photos of specks don't really do it justice. And then the third option is you split the difference, and so things are kind of far, but they're not really close enough to see detail, and it tends to be, excuse me, the worst of both worlds. So instead, I wanted to start off with a short movie. I tried to keep it under a minute, but I failed. I think it does a little bit better job of displaying kind of the splendor of the hawks as they're moving. And then let me get this going. And sorry, this first one's a little jittery of some Mississippi kites with some broadwings mixed in. And then it's roughly following the timeline of species as they move through. And I'll get to that a little more. Here you have just one of the large lines of hawks. Why you see that it's called a river. It's so wide, it's so long. There's often multiple layers involved. You can see that there are multiple species passing through, and you get large kettles. We have another black vulture mixed in with these broadwings. Sometimes the birds are quite close, and that's always fun too. And here you can see there's some birds that are kettling, some birds that are streaming. I'll get into the counting methods a little bit later. This is a little larger flock, a little larger kettle, and they just, again, some birds kettling, some streaming. That line continues out, so you can see it's a mixed species, different sizes, different shapes. Some are a little bit darker than others. That, as you can imagine, it becomes a bit of a challenge, but it's still just so incredible. And seeing these moving help more than just seeing pictures. But in addition to raptors, you get other species. So here we have wood storks flying. There's a number of aquatic species that move through in large numbers through Veracruz as well. Easily confused with wood storks at a distance or American white pelicans. I'll talk a little more about both of those, but you get nice big flocks of wood storks and pelicans, the kingas, which are one of the more difficult things to count because they do tend to be so close. And then I wanted to end with just a few scissor-tailed flycatchers moving through. So that's my short video. So that's kind of the what is Veracruz River Raptors. Now I want to talk about the why. And there's a couple ways in which this can be interpreted. And I wanted to start off with saying how it was established. And it was established in 1987 by Ernesto Reles and Sunza. And then with some assistance from Hawk Mountain, it grew to be a spot where they annually have 2 count sites in Cardell and Chichicaxtli. And the current coordinator, as I mentioned, his name is Kashmir Wolf. There have been other sites over different years for counting, but the 2 primary sites are Cardell and Chichicaxtli. So a different way of answering this question of why is Veracruz River of Raptors is looking at it from more of a geological perspective and a landform perspective. Most birds don't fly over water, they don't fly over high mountain ranges, and there's substantially more landmass in the northern part of North America than there is into Central America. So we have this funneling effect magnified by the Gulf on the one side and the mountains on the other. And it also helps that all of the land to the north of that is mostly open agricultural land. So those lands get warmed up very easily by the sun. That creates these warm air currents called thermals because the hot air rises, the cool air sinks, and the birds, rather than trying to flap and waste a lot of energy to fly thousands of miles, it's far easier if you just soar and conserve your energy. And so they'll just ride from one thermal to another. And it's roughly for each 1 unit up and each 1 unit of vertical, they can go for 7 units of horizontal distance. So if they rise for a mile, they can usually glide for around 7 miles. So you just find one thermal, you go to that one until you're just about down, you find another thermal, and it's much more energetically efficient than if you were to just try to fly the whole thing like say a hummingbird does across the Gulf of Mexico because they're hummingbirds and why not? So moving into the where, I showed a little bit, this count site I hope popped up okay from a kind of a broader area perspective. Zooming in a little bit more, we have the two count sites, Cardell in the east and Chichicaxtli a little further to the west. Cardell's about 25-ish miles from Veracruz City, and it has a population of around 20,000 people. And then another 7 or so miles to the west is Chichicaxtli, and it's a smaller town still. And those are the two primary count sites for Veracruz. Cardell takes place on the top of Hotel Bienvenidos, and typically viewing from this location is restricted to hotel guests and guided tours. And here's a shot just showing a view to the north from the top of the hotel. I skipped ahead. In Chichicaxtli, the count takes place at the Mario A. Ramos Observatory. And this land is leased from the town, but the town and the hawk site have really good communication, and it's a positive working relationship. And so they're able to build this wonderful observatory. Please do note that the observatory is closed on Mondays. And also, please don't try to go to the very, very top layer, as the very, very top is reserved just for the counters and assistants, unless you're expressly invited to go up there. Relatively new at the observatory is this really cool mural that was painted by one of the assistants in 2023. It has a compass and then silhouettes of all of the regularly occurring migrant raptor species that pass through. Here's a view showing just to the north from the observatory. So we have kind of the why, we have the where. Next, we move on to the when. The season for Veracruz is from August 20th to November 20th. As I mentioned, there has been an off and on spring count in a small town of Chavarrillo, which is a little south and east of Jalapa, but we'll come back to that a little bit later as well. So then in terms of how is VRR, that's also a complicated question. And in terms of the wonder and splendor, I don't think there are really enough adjectives that appropriately describe the spectacle that is Veracruz River of Raptors. From a weather perspective, it tends to be hot and humid for most of the season, although it does start to cool off in November. Typically, the winds start the day from coming out of the west and then shift around to the east later on. So it's often a good strategy if you have the flexibility to start your day in Cardell, and then as the winds shift around to the east, move over to Chichicaxtli, and you can usually get big flights at both sites because the migration path tends to move a little more towards Chichi in the afternoons and evenings. So another way to consider this is with regards to logistics and how is the site run. And so each location has at least three people daily, 2 counters and 1 assistant. The sites stay in constant communication with each other because for all that it's 6-ish miles between sites, it's still possible to see birds between the two sites. So communication is really important for determining which site will count which line. On some days, especially when it's really clear, it's really easy to think that the line is much closer to you than it actually is. There have been times we've radioed in and like, oh, I think this is going to be our line, and the other site's like, ah, it's right above us. So, despite the distance with the height and the size of the birds, you can see them over quite a range. With regards to the counters, usually so I mentioned there's two counters. Usually the counters break the sky up into halves. One counter will take one side, another counter will take the other side. But that doesn't always work because sometimes you have multiple lines and the main lines are just on one side. So in that instance, maybe one counter will take the top line, the other counter will take the bottom line. Again, communication is really important both between sites and between counters and assistants. And counting is a challenging problem. There's a lot of birds and sometimes there's a lot of species. So the best way that we try to do it is with the use of mechanical clickers. And it's not unusual for the counters, especially during peak times, to have anywhere between 3 and 6 clickers amongst your hands. And the clickers may be for different species, or maybe you have different counts for different species, typically clicking by ones, twos, fives, and tens. Though personally, I don't really like clicking by ones because I'd rather just click by twos. It's less noise. On rare occasions, if there's a line that you don't that's further behind you, then maybe you count by 20s or 50s, but we try to avoid that if and when possible. Similarly, another thing that we try to avoid is counting birds while they're kettling, so while they're spiraling around, because that movement really makes it challenging to count. It's much better to wait until they reach the top and then they just start streaming out. When they're all in one line, it's much, much easier than when they're spinning around. But there are rare instances where maybe the kettle's disappearing into the clouds, and so it's better to get something over nothing. So that's one example of the time where you might count birds while they're actively kettling. In addition to all of that, we also try to count all the birds that are migrating through. So that includes raptors, swallows, Dickcissels, kingbirds, scissor-tailed flycatchers, white-winged doves. There are a lot of birds that are migrating through, and so as best as we can, we try to count them all. Then for the assistants have an extremely difficult job because not only are they recording weather information on the hour, they're recording all of the raptor information that the counters are providing to them. They're also keeping an eye on where the counters are counting. So as I mentioned before, maybe you have one line that's on top and one line that's on the bottom, but further up they start to merge. So it's really important to get that communication clear so that they're not counting the same birds twice, or maybe they're looking around, the counters are busy with one line and there's another line, it's a really busy day. And so then the assistants will count that line, or the counters may be busy with two main lines, but there may still be other birds moving over. And so then the assistants keep track of that. In addition, they also count the aquatic species, so things like wood storks and hingas and American white pelicans. And on my initial saying that, maybe it doesn't sound like so bad. Oh, you're not counting all the raptors with multiple species and the really high numbers. But anhingas are one of the most difficult things to count because they tend to fly in fairly large flocks and they tend to be very, very close together and frequently wheeling. So it's in some ways it's very much a trial by fire. There's also active education staff and education programs going on. They have programs for the local kids twice a week. And you can also go in and borrow binoculars if you need to use binoculars for viewing the migration. Again, the observatory is closed on Mondays. They also have a little gift shop, and so you can get t-shirts, including this one, and field guides and stickers. And probably most importantly is in the freezer, they have bullies, which are kind of like ice cream, though they have some non-dairy ones. There's a wide variety of flavors. Personally, I recommend vanilla with chocolate chips. That's my favorite. And that really hits the spot on a hot, humid day, which, as I said earlier, is pretty much every day. So it's always a good day to have a bully. So with that, I'll transition into talking about the four main species that comprise the vast majority of the total number of raptors that migrate through. And I'll go roughly chronologically. Those four species are Mississippi kite, broad-winged hawk, Swainson's hawk, and turkey vulture. So starting with Mississippi kite moves through kind of starting in mid-August, going through, they end in kind of mid-October, but peak is usually late August to early September. And by mid-September, they've wound down quite a bit. On an average year, you're looking at around 200,000 to 300,000 Mississippi kites. Though I do want to make a special note of last year where they had over 600,000 Mississippi kites. Must have been amazing. Next, after the Mississippi kites are the broadwings. Usually broadwings start moving through in kind of mid-September, trailing off by late October, with peak being late September, early October. On an average year, you're looking at around 1.5 to 2 million broadwings a year. It's also a really good spot to see dark broadwings, of which it's a very, very low percentage. Of those 1.5 to 2 million broadwings, there's probably a few hundred dark broadwings that are counted every year. And 2023 was a particularly nice year for seeing dark broadwings. Kind of as I mentioned earlier in the talk of some zoomed out photos and some zoomed in photos, this one you can see all of these specks on the right are birds. And the photo doesn't do quite the level of justice that I think the video does, but it's still such an incredible thing to witness in real life. Next are Swainson's hawks, where Swainson's hawks usually start moving through maybe late September, but really into October and trailing off by mostly the end of the month in October. They peak in mid-October. And recently, you're looking at average numbers around 500,000, 500,000-ish, sometimes upwards of 600,000. But it seems to be a decline from old and from previous years of averaging upwards of 800,000. So Swainson's hawks also have a dark form and they have an intermediate form and all sorts of things in between. It's much more common to see those different color variants, and it's really fun to see them all in just a single flock. Finally, the last of the big four are turkey vultures. And while there's almost always at least some turkey vultures around, especially early in the season, they don't really start migrating until late September, and turkey vultures will go through into November. And like broadwings, you're looking at an average around 1.5 to 2 million turkey vultures a year. And it's really weird to say it, but you can have some really slow days, but still with lots and lots of turkey vultures. Because you can have a day with, I don't know, say 70,000 turkey vultures. But if they all pass through within the first hour, the next 9 hours can make for pretty slow time if you only have one or two species migrating by. So it's really strange to be like, oh, well, we only had 70,000 birds today, but it's because they pass through just all at the same time versus being more diffuse throughout the day that I think causes them to feel like it's a slow day. Switching over now to some other raptor species, and I figured transition would be nice to zone tails because at a distance, zone tails look very, very similar to turkey vultures. We have a zone tail here on the left and a turkey vulture here on the right, and the shape is almost identical at a distance. Of course, if you see them up close, it doesn't even look remotely similar. There's feathered head, yellow legs, yellow cere, white tail band. Zone tails look quite a bit different up close, but at a distance, they can be quite a challenge to pull from lines. There's typically a few hundred zone tails that migrate through each season, and they're also a resident, so it's possible to see them at both count sites, just hunting and hanging around. It's really nice to just have zone tails around. And yeah, there's zone tails in Southern California, but they're a little harder to find than the zone tails there. Greyhawks also move through, and typically you can get some throughout the season, but the main season for Greyhawks is mid to late October. And it's really fun to look up, have a kettle of birds and see that there's 40, 50 birds and they're all Greyhawks. And it's just not something you're ever going to get in the US, or at least hopefully not with climate change and the like. And Greyhawks also provide a number of identification challenges. Most superficially, they look like broadwings, though most of the broadwings have passed by the time the majority of the Greyhawks are moving through. But the young Greyhawks in particular look remarkably similar to Cooper's hawks. They have longer tails, they have longer wings than the adults, and so that gives much more of this Cooper's hawk-like shape. And so on the initial sound of Greyhawk and Cooper's hawk, well, these are completely different genera. You wouldn't think necessarily they're close. It's remarkably easy to confuse young Greyhawks for Cooper's hawks. Moving on to a few species that aren't so much migrants, but they're still around in reasonable numbers and are really fun to see are things like roadside hawk in the middle, and then great and common black hawks. Roadsides you can get from either count location, though I've had a lot better luck with them at Chichikaxle, and they've come in quite close and they're often vocal. And Blackhawks are a little less common at the count sites themselves, but if you go to any of the nearby rivers or along the coast, they become much more common. Separating the two can be quite a challenge, but that's a topic for a different day. Falcons also move through in quite high numbers relative to a lot of hawk sites. Now, that said, you're not looking at numbers like, say, Florida Keys, but relative to the majority of hawk count sites, you're looking at still quite high numbers of falcons. So thousands of kestrels, dozens of merlins, hundreds of peregrines. There are also some peregrines that nest in Cardell, and so you can often see them just harassing the local pigeons daily, and that's always fun. Some less common falcons and more local species, although with caracara, it's anybody's guess. Sometimes caracaras are within the lines, and so you think maybe they're migrating, but they're also residents, and who knows. Laughing falcons are around most easily at Chichikaxle rather than Cardell, though you can get them at both. Same for bat falcon. Bat falcon I've seen much more often from Chichikaxle than I have from Cardell. But Aplomado, you can get it either. And hook-billed kite moves through usually in the dozens. So now I'd like to switch over into the non-raptor species. I talked a little bit about anhingas and the challenge that is to count them. Another difficulty with anhingas beyond just them being these really tight balls and they're constantly swirling around and there's often hundreds of them in a group is if you just see one or two, it's a little surprising because they often are just in these large groups. And one anhinga at a distance, it's easy for the head to disappear, the bill to disappear. So all you see is kind of these long straight wings and a longer tail, and it can give you falcon, kite, harrier vibes of what is this weird thing? And then it finally gets closer and you realize, oh, it's one anhinga that's flying by itself. I would often joke that it's illegal in Veracruz for one anhinga to be flying because it's fairly uncommon, but it is a thing that can happen. But the flocks of anhingas are really, really fun. Another aquatic associated species that migrates through in large numbers are wood storks. Wood storks are spectacular. They're really large, black and white, and usually they're moving through in lines and kettles of dozens, occasionally hundreds. And every now and then you can find this really rare color abnormality in wood storks. It has this really like pink wash. For whatever reason, the bill tends to be this weird spoon shape as well. And that's always a treat. I'm of course kidding about roseate spoonbill being a weird color variant of wood stork, but I am serious that most of the time when roseate spoonbills fly through, they are flying in the midst of wood stork flocks. Easily confused with wood storks at a distance are American white pelicans. It's another bird that's very large. It's often mostly white with black in the wings. And while both can be in lines, the shape's usually a little bit different. The pelican's lines are usually a little wider. When they're circling, it's usually a little messier. They'll start crossing a little sooner and have more layers, but it's really subjective. Sometimes you get upwards of hundreds or even thousands of pelicans in a day. And one of my favorite things is watching them from Cardell in the evening as they fly towards the coast, and you just have these huge lines of hundreds of pelicans flying at sunset, and it's really fun. On the right side, you'll notice that those are not pelicans. I also wanted to make special mention of Franklin's gulls. Franklin's gulls also move through more along the coast than at the count sites, but you can get some fun flocks of Franklin's gulls moving through. We've even had some that were picked up by Modish towers that we didn't see moving through. So when and why that's going on, I don't know, but it's also nice to see nice groups of Franklin's gulls. And then the final aquatic associated species I'm going to talk about are ibi. I'm kidding, ibises. Both white and white face move through, usually in the dozens. And I've tried really hard to pull glossy from white-faced flocks, but it's really an effort and futility. That's such a challenging ID, and even in good circumstances, it can be difficult. That trying to do so while they're flying and far away and in bad light, it's probably not worth the effort. But we do get dozens of ibis, sometimes up into the hundreds in a given day. Continuing with swallows, swallows are probably one of the more undercounted species that move through. There's so many swallows that's pass through. I wouldn't be surprised if there's 1,000,000+ swallows that are moving, but there's so many of them, and it is really distracting. It's hard to keep track of all of the swallows, especially the species, and count everything else. So sadly, swallows fall a little to the wayside. Most common species of swallows moving through are cliff, barn, bank, and northern roughwing, but there are also records of some others such as cliff and mangrove and gray-breasted martin. I keep hoping that some year there'll be just a dedicated swallow counter, but the funding for the project is already tight enough and challenging enough that it hasn't happened, and I should probably just give up that hope. But we'll see someday. Continuing with swifts, white-collared is far and away most common swift and moves through in the largest numbers. You can get flocks of hundreds of white-collared swifts. And if you're unfamiliar with white-collared swift, imagine black swift, which is already a large swift, but even bigger with this nice white collar, as the name suggests, and they're very, very much fun to watch. You can also get black swifts moving through, Chatura swifts moving through, and even chestnut collards, though at a distance, chestnut collard can be difficult to ID. You often don't see that chestnut collard as they're migrating through, so that can be a challenging identification. Probably second only to swallows for non-raptors are white-winged doves, and the white-winged dove spectacle is also just in many ways breathtaking. My best morning, I had a little under 250,000 white-winged doves, and then about that same number of raptors in the same day. And you have just these waves upon waves of white-winged doves. There's multiple layers, there's multiple heights. They're going through all along the coast. There's just constant flocks moving through. And you can get some white-winged doves at Chi-Chi-Coxley, but it's a little easier and you get more at Cardell by orders of magnitude more. And it gets really exhausting counting that many, but it's just such an amazing thing in the moment of just having those clickers going wild with just line after line after line of white-winged dove moving through. They typically peak in October, kind of like mid-October. And then another pretty incredible thing to watch are scissor-tailed flycatchers. And hopefully some of these scissor-tailed flycatchers are visible. This is another one of those decisions of, do I just do a flock shot or an individual shot? And ultimately I decided with both, but for the sake of right now, I did a flock. And in some years, they've had over 50,000 scissor-tailed flycatchers in a weekend. I've never been quite that lucky, but I've often had days of over 100, occasionally days over 1,000. And for just such a charismatic species, a scissor-tailed flycatcher, to have them migrating by in such large numbers is a lot of fun. So as promised, here's a composite with some individual scissor-tails moving through a little bit closer, a little bit easier to see. The previous image was not a composite, that was a still shot. All of those birds were in those positions, whereas for this shot, I've just moved all these photos into one for the sake of closeness. Another tyrant flycatcher that moves through in the hundreds to thousands is eastern kingbird. And typically they're starting earlier in the season. They're passing through and peaking in September. And seeing flocks and flocks of eastern kingbirds is also loads of fun. And here's a few more, a little bit closer. I didn't realize I put animations in this. And then finally, I'm going to end with Dickcissels. And Dickcissels fly by in flocks of hundreds, occasionally thousands. I've heard tales from years past of them having 25,000 Dickcissels in a single day, and that just sounds absolutely incredible. And often there are other species that are mixed in with these flocks, so it's good to check for things like cowbirds, and occasionally something like a blue grosbeak or other passerines could be mixed in amongst the Dickcissel flocks. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some locations in the area, starting with the area around Chichikoxtli. So the observatory is this orange hotspot here. There's some nice fields up to the north here, and then also the river around Paso Mariano can be a good hotspot with 198 species reported, and Puente Nacional is also another nice hotspot near Chichikoxtli with 132 species recorded. A few species to pay special attention to are things like Veracruz wren, which was recently split from rufous-naped. And while the range is really restricted into Veracruz, it's very common, especially just in and around Chichikoxtli, especially if you walk to the river. Yellow-winged tanager is common at both sites, it's often hanging around with groups of blue-gray tanagers. It's one of the more common species to perch on the top of the tower at Hotel Bienvenido as well. And so that can be fun. You're just looking up and like, oh, there's a yellow-winged tanager right above me. Montezuma oropendola is not actually a regional rarity, but I just think they're really cool, so I wanted to include them into this talk as well. And you can find them in and around Chichi especially. And then last on this page is Mexican Sheartail. So it's kind of like a Lucifer hummingbird, but with an even more impressive tail. It's rarely visible from the observatory in Chichikoxtli. There are some flowers that hummingbirds like around the observatory, and sometimes they'll have feeders up, and I have seen one once at the feeder, but they're a little more reliable to those fields north of town that I mentioned. You can also get a number of cetacids nearby, and depending on which site you're at, the frequency varies. So olive-throated parakeets a little bit easier in Cardell, whereas the Amazons are a little bit easier in Chichikoxtli, including the endangered yellow-headed Amazon, which it's in its native range versus trying to see them at, say, a parrot roost in Los Angeles, though those parrot roosts are still really impressive. Moving now substantially to the southeast is the wetlands at Alvarado. And as you can see, 140 species have been recorded. There are some small tours that you can take that'll take you on guided trips through the wetlands, through the mangroves. And it's really fun to get this such a different habitat type than you're gonna find anywhere around Los Angeles. Some specialty species include black-collared hawk, American pygmy kingfisher, boat-billed heron. It's also possible to have sungrebe, though typically sungrebes are more easily heard than they are seen, but it's one of the better locations around to try for them. Shifting over to Camino de las Barrancas, and it has 294 species recorded, and despite the name, the area that you're birding doesn't actually have any canyons. There are canyons further down the road, but most of the birding location here is canyon free. And it's mostly these wet grassy fields, which can get really warm. There's a road that you can walk down and it can get really, really hot. So if you do bird Las Barrancas, please make sure to bring lots of water. There's almost no shade. But there are some really fun, cool species, things like lesser yellow-headed vulture, double-striped thick-knee, fork-tailed flycatcher, grassland yellowfinch, pinnated bittern, include snail kite. Snail kite you can get other spots too, but Las Barrancas is a particularly good spot for seeing snail kites as well. Pinnated bitterns tend to be difficult, but if you spend enough time, eventually one will fly around. If you have a scope, that makes it a little bit easier. And forktails should be around, thick knees are around. Grassland yellowfinches can be a little finicky. Continuing up the coast to Cansaburo, there have been 262 species recorded. There's also the road into Cansaburo is a hotspot with 248 species. And this is a really incredible migration spot. And during the years that they're banding birds for Veracruz River Raptors, they have the banding station here at Cansaburo. And it's this mix of there's some wet, reedy stuff that's really good for wood rails and crakes and things. There's hills and forest and beach and ocean, and it's a lot closer to the Gulf. And so you get a lot more birds that are a little more Gulf and water associated. So a higher number of falcons are probably moving through and get some great numbers of scissor-tailed flycatchers. Unlike that other shot, this is not a composite. This is a single image with 4 scissor-tailed flycatchers in it. Zone tails are a little easier to see, and even things like northern Hakana, and that's a young one. So they breed right there, and it's also a good spot for seeing white-winged dove migration a little closer than you see from Cardell. The last coastal site I'll cover is La Mancha with 296 species. It's one of those sites that pretty much anything can show up at any time. There's a number of trails through some forested wetlands, and then it's also right along the Gulf, so it makes it a really nice spot for seeing gulls and shorebirds and waders. And often you can just walk right up to them and they don't care. This reddish egret is one such example of it did not care in the least that I was there. It was just content on doing its cover feeding and holding its wings up, blocking things, and didn't care that I was there. Another good spot for seeing Franklin's gull migration. You can get some other specialties such as collared plover, bare-throated tiger heron, tricolored heron, gull-billed terns, and the road in is also a good spot for russet-naped wood rail. So now moving inland, a little to the south and east of Jalapa is Chavarrillo. And within the area around the town, there have been 258 species recorded. Now we're starting to get into some higher elevation forest. And this is the site of the spring count when it occurs. It's just right on the top of my friend's house. And here's a view showing what that view looks like. And it's quite a bit different from the already diverse habitats that we've covered so far, because you have this higher elevation forest. There's this really spectacular, very high waterfall that if you're going to Chalario, I highly recommend trying to see the waterfall. And then there's a lot of the birding that takes place along these railroad tracks as you get up higher and higher into the hills. And some species to pay special attention to are things like blue mockingbird, tinamous, trogons, toucans, rufous broad pepper shrike, crimson collared grosbeak, and kind of like with Texas, it's a lot easier to hear crimson collared grosbeak than it is to see them, as the ones that show up in Texas are often more easily heard. And that's frequently a thing here as well, but you can see them. And also blue mockingbird. And yeah, I know I said blue mockingbird twice, but they're worth it. Continuing to the northwest of Jalapa with La Jolla. And La Jolla is known locally for cheese, which as a Wisconsinite, I approve. And just to the north of town, there's some really cool trails through this much higher elevation and typically more coniferous forest. And this is a pretty rare sight of seeing La Jolla in the sunshine and the light. Usually it's quite gray and drizzly and wet, But on the off chance you do get a sunny day, it's very pleasant. And probably the biggest highlight for me for La Jolla is Red Warbler. I've seen Red Warbler multiple times now. I still don't really believe that it's real. It's just such a spectacular and bright, vibrant species, and the white cheek patch really shines through. And they're really, if you haven't seen Red Warbler, I highly, highly recommend the trip solely for Red Warbler. And then you can tack on the River of Raptors on top of that, because Red Warblers are just really, really amazing. But they're not the extent of amazing warblers that occur at La Jolla. You can get things like golden-crowned warbler, golden-browed warbler, slate-throated redstart. If you don't want to go to the one in San Francisco, olive warbler. The Stellar's jays there, they have Stellar's jays, same species as here, but it's a different subspecies. And instead of having that really dark black head, it's a deeper blue, which gives them a fairly different look. They're a really cool subspecies. And while striped sparrow isn't found usually at La Jolla proper, it's can be found in some of the fields a few miles away. And this is kind of the southeastern extent of the range of this endemic species. So the last location that I'm going to cover for this talk is going to be the waterfall at Texelo and Mexico. And the local area has 208 species reported. This is a little bit lower than the previous, this is a little lower in elevation than the two previous inland hotspots. But the main draw, the birds are good, but the waterfall is also really, really fun. It's a wider waterfall than in Chavarrillo. It's not quite as high, but there's still just so much water rushing through, and the white-collared swifts are often roosting and nesting right behind it, and so you can see them shooting in and out. There's other specialty species around, like white-bellied emerald and violet saberwing, some really fun hummingbirds that if you have the time, the waterfall at Hiko is really really nice. Continuing just quickly with some of the other animals, there are quite a few dragonflies that migrate through the Veracruz River of Raptors as well, especially like this wandering glider. And in some years, they've had dedicated dragonfly counters to try to keep track of that migration as well. Butterflies are present and numerous, and there's all manners of species. Malachite is one of my favorites, so I included photos of it twice. And this in 2023, I was very fortunate enough to see this coral snake. I'd never seen a coral snake before, and this one was just hanging out in a little ditch north of town in Chichicaxtla. And I wanted to end by talking about the food because the food is also just amazing. It's pretty much all inexpensive and it all is delicious. And I wanted to start with my favorite, which is tacos al pastor. So it's pork in a marinade of pineapple and achiote and guajillo chiles. And you can see it has a Euro cooker and they just cook it here and then they shave it down. The marinade kind of drips down with it. And in my opinion, the very best tacos al pastor are at Tacos Nora, which is just down the road from Hotel Bienvenido in Gardel. And what's even better is that you can buy them by the kilo. And now that doesn't make it sound, it sounds like it should be here, it'd be, oh, everything together weighs a kilo. No, 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 no. The meat, you get a kilo of meat, you get a kilo of tortillas, you get limes, you get radishes, you get all manner of onions, salsa verde, salsa roja, and it's wonderful. Continuing taco themes, you can also find others such as barbacoa, birria, queso birria. I also recommend. While not pictured here, I highly suggest that you try out a variety of moles. Seems like each mole is a little different, and most of them are also spectacular. It's hard to go wrong with tamales and also with chilequiles. And I find that then you can get both salsa roja and salsa verde chilequiles. And I find that when I'm in the US and I'm curious about how authentic is a given Mexican restaurant, if they have chilequiles, that's usually a pretty good sign that it's going to be authentic food. And then the final food side I wanted to end with was seafood. Veracruz is known for its seafood. It's right next to the Gulf. Anything that you get that has seafood with it is just scrumptious and very, very delicious. And I'll end with one of my favorite stories of my time when I was there in 2016. I'd gone birding at Las Barrancas with some friends, and we ended at a restaurant in Boca del Rio, right on the Gulf. And in addition to the chips and salsa that were on the tables, there are also just plates of oysters. And so we're eating these chips, we're eating the salsa, we're eating the oysters with lemon wedges and hot sauce, of course. And finally, I just asked my friend, I said, well, how much are these oysters? And he kind of looks at me strange. What do you mean? I said, well, we're eating all these oysters. How much are they? He said, they're like the chips. So what do you mean they're like the chips? He said, they're free. I said, what do you mean they're free? He said, you don't pay for it. What does free mean? And so we had to have eaten what nowadays, I don't even know, $150 worth of oysters just as a free appetizer. And it was really, really a nice time and truly special, which I think are really the words I'd like to end on because it's such a wonderful spot, and the raptor migration is amazing. But hopefully, now you see that there's other aspects beyond the raptor migration that are also amazing. And so, with that, I will take any questions.
Fantastic, Ted. I can't tell you how much we enjoyed that. Um, if you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A down on the at the bottom of your screen. That'll help us keep track of it and allows us to go ahead and read them out because they're when for the recording, people won't be able to see the questions and all that.
So I have a question about the mechanics of counting all of these birds. You said
Yes,
you have
good question.
multiple clickers. So when you do it personally, what do you usually, right? And there's many species coming over all at once. How many clickers do you usually have, and how do you arrange them? And are you calling out things out to assistants for other species? I mean, how do you manage this? Because this sounds incredibly difficult.
It can be, especially if it's a really diverse line. A lot of it depends on the particular line. So, more often than not, there's one species that kind of dominates the line. And so, then on, say, my right hand, I should have brought clickers in. I don't have any that are inside. I guess I'll use kind of this cable if it shows of the clicker part. So you can have one clicker here. If you move another clicker around so it's inverted, you can have another one there, and then you can have a third here. And that's probably the most comfortable way to have three. You can also have some others like within your other fingers further back. I find at this point, I prefer to try to have all of my clickers in one hand so that I can have the other hand for binoculars. Because if you have clickers in both hands that you're clicking, the binoculars start to move around quite a bit.
So you usually
But
have like four
usually,
clickers in your hand, something like that.
pardon, yeah, it's often I'm usually trying for three, but on really busy days, I'll go upwards of five or six.
and and speaking of clickers, so do you pre-designate how many clicks per are a species? You know, you said some are one, some are five, some are tens.
That you keep track of in your head.
Okay.
And
Because of course you have nothing else to do in your head to keep track of.
well, so one of the things that helps is as you're going through, especially kind of during the main times, I find consistency with the clickers is really important. So if like Broadwing season, I'll have okay, this is my main, this is the easiest thing for me to do. So I'm gonna be clicking those by fives, and then maybe there's Swainson's hawks that are starting to move through. So I'll click those by twos. Turkey vultures are moving through, maybe also clicking them by fives, and then having something lower that maybe I'm having a slower day with Broadwings and I can take my time and click by twos, or maybe it's a busier day and so I'm clicking those by tens. And then for individual species, a lot of it depends on the day and kind of how busy everyone is for how much you're keeping rattling around in your head and how much you're calling things out. If it's something that's particularly uncommon, call that out right away. Like if a red shoulder or a Harris's hawk or something flies by,
Right.
call those out right away. But if you have a Cooper's hawk, you may have a few Cooper's hawks. So maybe there's just kind of a running tally going on in the back of your mind of, okay, I've had 2 Cooper's hawks and, 12 kestrels. And
Yeah.
then the nice thing about the clicking is you don't need to keep track. You don't need to hold those numbers in your head. You just kind of need to keep an eye of where's my thumb.
Right.
And that really helps to streamline a lot of it. Because if I was trying to do multiple iterations of 5s and 10s, that does get pretty overwhelming pretty quickly.
I can
Yeah.
imagine. And so after and while after a flock goes by and all that, you'll download all this information to the assistant and start fresh.
Yep. Yep.
Oh,
Usually after line passes or sometimes on the hour, though occasionally it's just so busy that we have to wait a little bit. But we try
yeah,
to get everything in at the very least every hour. And otherwise, yeah, usually after a line passes.
yeah, absolutely.
Wow. So it makes, I think the Christmas bird count is going to be way easier. I thought Paiute Ponds was difficult, but no, this sounds
Before we get
way harder.
Yeah, before we get into the Q&A, I did have a question about zone-tailed hawks.
Yeah.
Since you saw many going through and many turkey vultures going through, did you see zone-tailed hawks going through with the turkey vultures or separate?
Both.
With
Both. Sometimes they're with turkey vultures, sometimes they're with broadwings, sometimes they're by themselves, sometimes they're with Swainson's hawks. It's just kind of whatever.
Okay,
It's not anything in particular. It's not like they're always with one or the other. It's not like they're never with one or the other. But so like the one photo earlier showed that was also not a composite. That was the actual photo of both of those species that were together.
right, right. Interesting. Okay.
Cool. So Lance has a question. What about motor stations near Veracruz? Are there any? And if so, what have they turned up?
There are some, and they're starting to do more. I need to look a little closer to everything that they've gotten. I know we're getting a lot of Franklin's gulls, some whippoorwills. Um, what else? There were a few others, but Cash has been trying to get multiple motor stations put up. There's one right up on the observatory, and he has a couple others, and I'd have to get back to you, Lance, on the locations.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Interesting. Just it's fascinating. So when you get hired on to do a count, you're there for the entire season usually, or the counting season usually.
Usually, yes. In 2023, I was only there for 10 weeks because they needed someone and I couldn't quite be there the entire time. But usually it's the entire season.
Great, great.
Yeah, and that
I
probably makes it easier too because you start off when the numbers are smaller,
yeah,
and then you start getting used to
It
it.
ramps up pretty fast because the count starts on August 20th and peak Mississippi kites just another like week or two after that.
Okay.
yep. Amazing. Just absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mark and I, along with Susan Frank, were in Panama and were able to see the just a river of raptors going through and all that. And
Yeah.
it was
Beginning of
very exciting.
October, I believe, right? Was that when
Yeah,
you were there?
it was like 35,000 an hour.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
and
it
and they were
for anyone,
mostly Swainson's broadwings, were the two.
Short-tailed.
yeah. If
Yeah.
I've not done Canopy Tower or Kakoldi yet, but I
yeah,
very much would like to do both.
Yeah, this was on top of Canopy Tower. Yeah.
yeah. And for anyone on the watching or whatever, if you haven't seen in Veracruz or at the Canopy Tower, the river of hawks go through and all that, it's an experience that you really should experience at least once in your birding career. Just really exciting. Mark, I think we're running out of questions.
I
I
think
have a
we
question
are.
about, what the pattern of migration is. do you get big like multi-day migrations depending on weather, or do you have a good day and a slow day and a slow day and a good day and a slow day, or are they clustered? Or how does that work?
It's pretty mixed, and as with most things, it's kind of northwest winds. One of the nice things for Veracruz has is that whatever Corpus gets, typically Veracruz gets like 2 to 3 days later, and often at the very least doubled the numbers that Corpus has. And so that can give that's a pretty good indication of what's to come, is kind of using Corpus as a barometer.
Yeah.
Do they have hawk watching activities there that are reported real time?
So everything's put into, yeah, I think we're using tablets, and I think that's all going directly into Hawk Count at the moment. It's not, the last I knew, they weren't using anything like Dunkadoo or Trektellan, but I believe all of the data are uploaded to Hawk Count, at least on the hour, but I think it's as they're put in.
Oh, great.
All right. Well, we have another question that popped up.
Lance asked, presumably there's migration on the west coast of southern Mexico too. What's happening there?
Seems
Like
reasonable. I don't know. I suspect it's probably not as much, just because so much of the landmass funnels it all to the east, that I know in the spring there's some nice hawk spots along Oaxaca. So be a little careful with all the wind turbines now, but there's so much wind that goes through. But in terms of like central and northern north coast or west coast, I don't know.
Interesting. I think we're running out of questions for you, Ted. That was incredibly good. Great talk, actually. And I don't mean to rush you out of here, but I have to go and get some tacos. I'm starving.
Yeah, that's the downside of having food at the end.
I had to talk about the food because it's
We're now all going to stuff our faces. Yes.
Yes, I need to go hit that taqueria before it closes.
By the pound.
Yes.
By the kilo, heck with pound.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah.
Anyways, thank you again, Ted. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk. And for everyone on this Zoom, also Ted has given some wonderful talks for LA birders. You can go to our website and browse for those talks. And join us next year for another wonderful round of webinars by Los Angeles birders. And Mark, Susan, Frank, Ted, Surya, have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. And
Same to everybody.
You too. Thank you very much, Ted.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ted.
And have a great CBC season.
Yeah, thank you. You as well.
Yeah, but get all my clickers on like
yeah.
Yes.
I only have 2 with me, I think, out here.
We could only hope. You take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good
Bye.
night. Good night.
Bye.